Welcome, everyone, to this evening's Suffrage Forward event. I am Paulette Ross, Chair of Suffrage Forward, a component fund under Rockland Community Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. You know, since our launch officially in January of this year, we have produced several events that celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage movement, and also bringing awareness to the strength, resiliency, and persistence of all those women and girls in the past, and certainly some in the present. And we hope to inspire people, all people, in the present and the future to our quest for equality for all of us. To view all that we've done, you can go to our website, SuffrageForward.org, visit us on Facebook and on Instagram. We also so enjoy and appreciate collaborating with like-minded nonprofits and other organizations. And this evening, we are so pleased to be able to collaborate with the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives. And it's my honor to introduce you all to your hostess for this evening, Claire Bose Sheridan. Now, Claire is a writer, producer, and host of the award-winning radio show, Crossroads of Rockland History, which is presented by the Rockland Historical Society, or I should say the Historical Society of Rockland County, where she served as the executive director, an interim executive director, president, and trustee. Before joining the Historical Society, Claire was the Senior VP and Business Director at Sotheby's. So now, why don't I just let Claire take it away so that she could introduce you to our distinguished panel from the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives. Go for it, Claire.
Thanks, Paulette. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the Orangetown Suffragist. I am a fan of the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives. It's a great museum right here in Rockland County. And right now, they have a wonderful exhibition called Orangetown Suffragist. And we are thrilled tonight to be sharing it with you. As you saw in the little opening credits, Emily, the curator of collections, took us on a little video walkthrough of the exhibition. We'll be hearing from Emily Hingle, who's the Curator of Collections. We'll also be hearing from Elizabeth Skrabonja, who's a curator there, and she will be speaking to us specifically about one suffragist who's very little known, and you'll hear more about her later. But first, I'm going to turn it over to the historian for the town of Orangetown and the director of the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives, Mary Cardenas. Good evening, Mary.
Thank you, Claire. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives. Right now, you are visiting the Isaac de Pew House, which is located at 196 Chief Bill Harris Way, which was formerly called Blaisdell Road. The house we're in was built sometime during the Revolutionary War by Isaac de Pew, and it's a 1.5 story brown sandstone and frame that was in the de Pew family until 1881. Now, these houses were built under the direction of carpenters who were a variety of tradesmen, and with the help of the family, members, neighbors, laborers, and whoever would participate, the house was constructed. Although these sandstone houses are called Dutch colonials, they came into being long after New Amsterdam was lost and now became New York. The Dutch sandstone houses are unique since they are only found here in the Hudson Valley, and probably because sandstone was so readily available and really easy to work with. As you noticed, this house has a porch or a stoop, and it would have little benches on it so that the occupants of the house would sit outside during the summer heat and kind of cool off. Now, when this house was built, it was likely to have a center hall and perhaps 4 rooms, and 2 would probably be little workrooms. The house has a gambrel roof, which extend into wide eaves. And the eaves provided protection because it diverted the melting snow and rain away from the foundation of the house. Gambrel roofs were used in New England and then here in the Hudson Valley. The house stood on a farm about 106 acres, and the property was probably given to Isaac de Pew and his bride, Bretchie or Bridget Smith, through Isaac's maternal grandfather, Abraham Garretson Blauvelt. Isaac was born in 1740 and died in 1823, and his wife was born in 1746, and she died in 1826. Their only son, Abraham, was born in 1768, and he died in 1833. He married Martha Cooper, and their only child, Elizabeth, was born in 1809. Elizabeth married Cornelius J. Holdrum, and they had 3 daughters and 2 sons. Elizabeth lived in this house until her death in 1881. However, her estate was sold out of the family in 1900 to Morell and Blauvelt, who rented the property to tenant farmers. About 1929, the homestead and farm was purchased by the state of New York as part of the Rockland Psychiatric Hospital, which made up 638 acres of the psychiatric facility. That was probably when the shed and the dormers were added, both to the front and back of the house, and a new addition was attached to the old section of the house, upgrading it for a modern family in the 1930s. However, by the late 1980s, the state of New York began to downsize all their psychiatric facilities. And on January 22nd, 2003, the state of New York sold the surplus land from the downsizing of the Rockland Psychiatric Hospital, which now is called Rockland Psychiatric Center, and some 348 acres was sold to the town of Orangetown, which included the former de Pew Holdrum house. At this time, the Orangetown Museum had outgrown the Starr House headquarters, and this acquisition was a natural extension and the best possible solution for expansion of the museum. With the new purpose, there was much work to be done and to bring the house up to code. The house had been boarded up some 15 to 20 years, so that the interior had sustained some damage. I went before the town board and asked for some funding to develop the house into a second museum site. And the town board really agreed and were very enthusiastic about it. Many individuals and organizations helped to upgrade this house. Since the Pew House has opened up with its first exhibit, Who Was Here, in October of 2007, there have been 11 more presentations, all focusing on a particular aspect of Orangetown's rich history. The museum in conjunction with the Orangeburg Library, sponsored 3 wine and cheese soirees with live music included. There have been 17 antique and collectible sales and on the museum property, and many other events also have taken place here. The residents of Orangetown and the town board can be proud of all the efforts by those individuals, town departments, and organizations that helped us develop the Pew House. We also want to thank the staff whose exhibits were well appreciated. Altogether, the Pew House has become a first-class museum. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. We really appreciate that. That's great to put us into where you are right now, which is inside the museum. And now we'll hear from Emily Hingle, Curator of Collections of the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archive.
Thank you, Claire. First, I'd like to thank SuffrageForward for inviting us to have this program with your organization. It has been such a pleasure working with you, Claire Sheridan, and Paulette Ross, and we look forward to doing more programs with you in the future. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Emily Hingle, and I am the Curator for Collections at the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives. I'm responsible for caring for the collection in both our Isaac de Pew House and our Michael Salyer House. I had the pleasure of assisting our exhibitions curator, Elizabeth Skrabonja, who you will hear from soon, with the research and installation of Orangetown Suffragists, our ode to 100 years of women's suffrage in the US and in Orangetown, New York. So American women fought for more than 7 decades to earn the right to vote. During that time, they organized, lectured, petitioned, lobbied, paraded, picketed, and went to jail for daring to support suffrage. The movement questioned the country's commitment to democracy, highlighted persistent racial and class tensions, and challenged domestic relationships. It shaped the individuals involved in the struggle, at times demanding enormous sacrifice. In the early days of the Republic, women had few rights. Most married women could not own property, a common requirement for voting, and enslaved women, considered property themselves, essentially had no legal rights. Inspired by the growing abolition movement, women began advocating for their own rights by the mid-19th century. The 1848 Seneca Falls Convention in New York was the first of many gatherings dedicated to advancing women's equality. Following the upheaval of the Civil War, the expansion of civil rights for African Americans during Reconstruction ignited a renewed effort for universal suffrage, though disagreements over strategy divided the movement. In the 20th century, the next generation of suffrage leaders introduced new tactics. Adopting strategies used by the British suffrage movement, activists held open-air meetings and parades. Beginning in 1917 and throughout World War I, the National Women's Party staged a sustained daily protest at the White House, decrying the hypocrisy of America's defense of democracy abroad, while women were denied the vote at home. Some picketers were arrested and imprisoned, bringing visibility to the movement and forcing the suffrage question onto the front page of newspapers and magazines. The combination of civil disobedience and political lobbying eventually produced results, leading to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Few of the women who began the suffrage campaign before the Civil War lived to see their victory. So I'm going to walk you through some of our exhibit. The following presentation is taken from objects on display right now at our Isaac de Pew House, and specifically from our Orangetown Suffragist virtual timeline, which you can find now on our website at www.orangetownmuseum.com. All you have to do is just click on our homepage and go to virtual timeline, and this is the home screen that you will get. So I'm going to walk you through some features of our Orangetown Suffragist timeline. So being a local history museum, we place a high importance on the local places and faces and connect them to the bigger picture. And these are some wonderful pictures we have that we recently accepted from the Bob Knight collection, which it's a phenomenal collection, but this is just some of the pictures that we have. And they're all original photographs. Some are dated 1896. And unfortunately, we don't know the identity of these women, but it gives us a glimpse into what the romanticized life of a woman looked like at the turn of the century in New York. So also at this time was a time of revolutionary inventions. We saw things like the telephone and the typewriter invented, and that was a great help in establishing communication between suffragists so we can get our right to vote. And we actually have two typewriters on display right now. They're fabulous Underwood Typewriters, and we have a very cool phone from 1915. To show what life was like for the woman at the time, what was expected of them, we feature numerous items that you would typically find in the household domain, like these washboards and sewing machine. And the sewing machine is very cool because in 1860, I said, the New York Times wrote, "No other invention has brought so great a relief for our mothers and daughters than the sewing machine." And you can see that that was what was expected of us at the time. And this particular sewing machine is a Wilcox and Gibbs sewing machine that was manufactured in Nyack, New York. And at the time, the house was a women's domain, and what was expected of her, to dare for more and to dare for suffrage went against the social norms at the time. The sewing machine also allowed us to create manufactured outfits like this 19th century christening coat. And this particular christening jacket was worn by Mr. Louis Leon Blauvelt, who we have many Blauvelts featured in our exhibit. And we have many christening and baptismal gowns because evidently they're all well preserved because they're worn so infrequently. And if you see in the top left corner, we actually have Louis Leon Blauvelt wearing this same dress. And while having a formal education was not so common for women, in Rockland there was the Rockland County Female Institute. And the Rockland County Female Institute was incorporated by the regents of the University of the State of New York in 1855, and it opened the following year after that. And it was located on a 10-acre lot on the banks of the Hudson River, and we actually have the graduating class of 1858, these lovely young ladies daring to do more than what was expected of them. And some women even dared to go even further than that. And one woman we feature in one of our cases is the amazing Dr. Elizabeth Blauvelt. And she was born in the year 1873, and her father was the pastor of the Tappan Dutch Reformed Church for 19 years. And Elizabeth Blauvelt earned her medical degree in the year 1904 from Johns Hopkins University. And she practiced medicine at the Women's Hospital on 14th Street in New York City, which was later renamed St. Vincent's. And after she got her degree and went to the Women's Hospital, she traveled to Amoy, China as a medical missionary. And after succumbing to illness 3 years later, her legacy as a humanitarian was honored in the construction of the Elizabeth Hedges Blauvelt Hospital in Tongan, China, and it's pictured here. Orangetown Suffragist tells the stories of the young women growing up in the suffrage movement, and we feature the belongings of several young women in Orangetown, including the collection of Miss Lillian Rose Perry pictured here. And she was a lifelong resident of Nyack, and she was greatly influenced by her aunt Lila Mann, chairman of the Women's Political Union of the Nyacks. And she graduated from the Emma Willard School in Troy, New York, which Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to that same school in 1831. And we have featured her diary from the year 1921 when she was only 24 years old. And she marked down November 8th as election day. And that would have been the second year that she would have been able to vote. And we know she was a suffrage supporter because this is her pin. And it's so perfect, I love it. It's important to make the connection that the suffrage movement was happening at the same time as World War I, which was back then known as the Great War. And this particular letter was sent to Miss Lillian Rose from a beau he was overseas in France. And you can read the full transcription of this letter on our virtual timeline. And it's quite a read, and we transcribed it too, so you're not having to read all the scripts. And our exhibit features several World War I items, including these two nurses' uniform jackets on loan from the Harrington Park Historical Society. They gave us many things, and we are so grateful for them. If they're on here, hello. We feature several nursing items that belong to a Miss Vera Van Ostrand, and she was stationed in Camp Merritt, New Jersey, that is. And it's important to note that this was the same time, 1918, we were learning about this influenza epidemic that was going on 100 years ago. And it's striking to see the resemblances between then and now. And to have these things on exhibit right now is particularly striking. We also feature the items belonging to Miss Jane Elliott of Orangeburg, and you'll hear a little bit more of her from Elizabeth, so I won't go too much into her, but she wasn't a nurse, she was more of a social worker, and she went overseas to France, and this on the left is a gift that was given to her by the French, and on the right is a letter of commendation from her General John J. Pershing, and it's commending her achievements and her effort for her part in the war. Also on loan, we have the items belonging to Miss Caroline Lexell Babcock, who is a mover and a shaker of her time, did so many great things for the suffrage movement, and all of the items that we have from her are on loan from the Historical Society of Rockland County, which was so generous to lend us these items, and it really helps us tell the story of what was going on in Orangetown to get the vote. And Caroline Lexell Babcock was an American pacifist, suffragist, co-founder of the Women's Peace Union, and executive secretary of the National Women's Party. And we have her sash in her bag, and you can just imagine what it would have been like to pass out leaflets and pamphlets to get the vote. And there's another letter that we have from her right here. This is a letter that she wrote in 1912 to the secretary of the Waldron Post, showing her tireless effort to the cause. And then on the right is her sash again, which I just can't get over because it's just so, so amazing. And then Orangetown Suffragist features, we explore the popular culture of the turn of the century into the Roaring 20s. And after the vote was secured in that August of 1920, we see that the pop culture just radically changed. And it was a combination of the end of World War I, the start of Prohibition, but most importantly, getting the vote. And if you just imagine the photos that I shared in the very beginning of the tight corsets, the mutton sleeves, to go to the flapper dresses, was just we just felt so empowered after that. This is what we explore the pop culture, and it just changed radically. And the woman pictured on the right is Miss Helen Gardner, who was the writer, producer, and star of her own film company in Japan called the Helen Gardner Picture Players. And she ended up making 11 feature films, including a 5-reel film called Cleopatra in the year 1920. And then we also feature seats from the Broadway Theater of Nyack circa 1915. And this was when you would see vaudeville performances and the silent films with orchestral accompaniment. And on the right, which I don't know if you can see right now, but we're sitting right in front of the sheet music. And if you just look at the sheet music on the left was from before the year 1920, before we got the vote, and you could just see how everything was very romantic, whimsical, sentimental. And then after we got the vote on the right, you could just see that the pop culture just radically changed. We see the flappers, the titles change, everything's radically, it's great, it's liberal, it just changed everything. So just to conclude, Orangetown Suffragist honors the women of Orangetown that were engaged in the national movement and the legacy that they left us. The fight upended traditional notions of gender roles and forced a reconsideration of the duties and privileges of citizenship. By recognizing our own Orangetown suffragists, we continue to promote the advancement of women and girls in our community. And again, you can come see our exhibit, and you can also see the Orangetown Suffragist timeline, which these are all taken from. So thank you for letting me speak. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to my amazing colleague, Elizabeth Skrabonja, who is the exhibitions curator for this wonderful exhibit. And I'll let you take it away. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Emily. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm going to stop.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was my great pleasure to curate Orangetown Suffragist. And I have to tell you, when I was choosing the artifacts and designing the exhibit, we were trying to create this balance between what really is, what was happening at the time, what women looked like, what they were involved with, and how this was reached out. So I have to tell you, Mary Cardenas and I took a trip to the Nyack Library, and we met with Myra Starr, who introduced us to a fabulous woman named Grace Sayers, almost towards the end of planning the exhibition. I had the photographs ready, the costumes, the artifacts, and then suddenly Grace Sayers. So it's my extreme pleasure to tell you a little bit about her. Grace Adele Morris Sayers, the first woman elected to the South Nyack Board of Trustees in 1919, the first woman to become a member of the Nyack Board of Education in 1920, and the first woman municipal historian of the village of South Nyack. We see her here in 1928, turning the first spadeful of earth when ground was broken for the junior and senior high school. Her impeccable heritage as a distinguished resident of Orangetown is indisputable, descended from Adrian Lambertson and Lambert Adrianson, who were among the original 1686 signers of the Orangetown patent. She was also a granddaughter of the infamous Commodore William Voorhees. He had several yachts, the Tidal Wave and the Gracie, which won many cups. And as well, she was a cousin to the famous American surrealist artist, Joseph Cornell. Grace was positioned to a life of service, and she met that challenge straight on. Next slide. The conflict of World War I was known as the Great War, as Emily mentioned. Probably the most accomplished manager and organizer of community effort during this period at home was Grace Sayers, 45 years old in 1917. She did not travel overseas to support our troops in Europe, as we see here, Miss Jane Elliott, there she is in the center of Orangeburg. But the efforts of the home front were not to be diminished. There she is right there. Next slide, please. Known as the Red Cross Lady for her work organizing 13 Red Cross branches throughout the county, Grace Sayers was the ultimate fixer, coordinating Liberty Loan drives, mass fundraisers, clothing drives, and the production of hundreds of thousands of medical dressings that were sent overseas. She was the supervisor of the Children's Department for Belgium Relief and coordinated trips for hundreds of soldiers from Camp Merritt to come to Nyack for a good meal and local entertainment. The army that served Grace Sayers was mostly female and rose to the occasion during the influenza epidemic of fall-winter 1918. Sound familiar? Broth and food were delivered to the sick and their families, and care was administered as needed. Upper Nyack, Nyack, and South Nyack and villages and health boards cooperating with the Red Cross rented and equipped a building in South Nyack for an emergency hospital. It also sounds familiar. Just at this time, the chapter staged a drive for thousands of influenza masks. Local women crowded the headquarters and sewed the masks in record time. Next slide, please. Well, one would think that individuals that were making such a substantial contribution to the general welfare of the nation would be able to vote in national elections, but unfortunately, this was not the case during World War I. Sister suffragists were valiantly demonstrating throughout the country. Since the mid-1880s, the struggle for the ballot went on in a nonviolent, determined manner and differed from the more militant approach taken on by the women in England. They were clear about their goals: not victory over men, but equality; not constant war, but reconciliation. They were ordinary citizens forced to fight for their own rights against tremendous odds and social inequities. And they eventually did persevere. Next slide, please. In November of 1917, New York voters passed an amendment to the New York State Constitution granting women full suffrage. New York was the first Eastern state to do so, and it was a major victory for the suffrage movement, universally recognized as a result of women's increased visibility in the war effort. I believe this places Grace Sayers as a pivotal player in the New York state vote. Grace Sayers led by example, conducting a movement involving over 4,000 local women tirelessly committed to an international relief program. It was impossible to ignore their efforts any longer. Here, we see a clipping from the Nyack Evening Journal. Women get the franchise right on October 12, 1918. Miss and Mrs. Voter will be given her first opportunity towards exercising her right of franchise in Rockland County. The writer of this article notes that women over the age of 30 will not be required to indicate their age. Next slide, please. Well, in this newspaper clipping from after that election, which is dated November 6th, 1918, women decide election here by unprecedented vote. Women's participation in the state election for the first time was noteworthy for two things. One, that they voted without a hitch in the polling machinery, and the other, that they voted in such surprisingly large numbers. And there was a huge turnout, and it did make a big difference. Next slide, please. So, when the vote comes up for the village trustee in Nyack, after some political machinations, her name is put forward. And who, at that time, was more universally respected and qualified? The Nyack Evening Journal of February 13, 1919, Mrs. Sayers, a candidate for village trustee, entering the race at the last minute. She wins with an unprecedented margin and makes history. Next slide, please. So here we see a copy of her signed oath of office from March 24th, 1919. Grace Sayers went on to become the only woman elected in 1920 as member of the Nyack Board of Education and was appointed as the first municipal historian. She produced an incredible 37-page treatise in 1920, documenting the village's World War I effort. And this is actually what called Myra Starr's attention, was this incredible document. She went on to support local green spaces, overseeing the planting of over 100 linden and maple trees, and served the town for 13 years as senior account clerk in the Orangetown tax collector's office. Throughout her long life, she led by example, by giving back to the community and helping to open doors for other women along the way. Next slide, please. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing American women the right to vote nationwide on August 18, 1920, its adoption was celebrated, as here Alice Paul raising a glass to freedom. Grace Sayers in Orangetown, meanwhile, was already on her way to making history. Next slide. She set the stage for such trailblazers as Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan worked on her groundbreaking international bestseller, The Feminine Mystique, while she was living in Grandview and implementing a years-long gifted and talented program for the local school system. This program was called the Community Resources Pool, and they were weekend classes that brought in intellectuals, professors, mostly from New York City. And this is between the period of 1958 and 1963. In her book, The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan wrote, "Theirs was an act of rebellion, a violent denial of the identity of women as it was then defined. It was the need for a new identity that led these passionate feminists to forge new trails for women. They had to prove that women were human. They had to shatter violently, if necessary, the decorative Dresden figurine that represented the ideal woman of the last century." Next slide, please. In 2019, almost 100 years after Grace Sayers became the first woman elected to public office in Orangetown, Teresa Kenny became the first woman to serve as supervisor of the town of Orangetown. Next slide, please. Well, there's still a long way to go. And the future, the legacy of the past is in the hands of the young, like these adorable Brownie Girl Scouts that visited Orangetown Suffragist. You know, it was initially funds that were put together by Girl Scouts in New York City that were selling Girl Scout cookies that went for our fabulous monument in Central Park. Well, the future is in their hands, and even though we have a long way to go, I think it's all going to go well. So thank you all very much. And I return you to our director, Mary Cardenas.
That was very informative. And I'm sure our viewers would like to come and visit the Orangetown Museum thanks to your delivery and Emily's delivery. There's so much to see, and it's a beautiful exhibit. It's very colorful. It touches on a lot of the ladies that lived in the area, some of them from Nyack, of course, but some came from Pearl River. We don't think about that. So I invite all of you, the viewers, to come to the Orangetown Museum, the Pew House. We're located at 196 Chief Bill Harris Way. And we're open on Tuesdays and Fridays from 10 to 2, Sundays 1 to 4, and always by appointment. So look for us on our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. So we did have a question from the audience, and we would love to open the floor to questions now from our audience. The first question we have is from Carol Levin, our great friend who did a wonderful program with you with the Orangeburg Library, where she portrayed Jeanette Rankin. Her question was about the sash that you showed, Emily, that belonged to Caroline Lexow Babcock. And her question was about the color of the sash. And she was wondering if the colors of the sash was it faded, or because it didn't seem to be purple and gold. So she was just curious about that.
Well, it is very faded, but you can definitely see the purple in it still. But yeah, the picture is slightly looks better on camera, but the color is great on it, and it's such a fabulous thing to just see it. And even the Votes for Women bag too, the green in it, it just pops, and it's such a treat to see in person, for real.
Good. Now I have a question about Myra Starr. Elizabeth, you spoke about how Myra introduced you to the world of Grace Sayers. So could you tell us who Myra Starr is and her connection to the museum?
Well, Myra, from my understanding, she is a historian connected with the Nyack Local History Room. And Mary and we basically went just to do some last minute research and just to tie up some loose ends. And Myra, basically she came after us with these documents and said, wait, you cannot possibly do an exhibit about Orangetown suffragists without knowing Grace Sayers. And it was pretty remarkable, because we knew about Caroline Lexow, we knew about Lulu Serwin, all these people you can learn about if you come over to the Tinetti family, all of the many Blauvelts, but Grace Sayers, that was something a little bit extra. So it's my understanding that Myra Starr is another history detective, and we're very thankful to have that connection.
Great, thank you very much. Just going to check to see if we have any other questions. We'd love to open the floor if anybody has any questions. The other question that I had was about just about the extent of the Blauvelt family, and we see so many times we see that name. So tell us about that connection, the connection of the Blauvelt family specifically to Orangetown.
Well, maybe Mary is the best for that.
That one. Well, way back when in the 1600s, prior to 1686, there was a family in Lower Manhattan called Garrett. It was Garrett Hendrickson. Garrett Hendrickson had 10 children, and actually he had 12 because he had 2 wives. So 10 of those 12 children came here to what was then Orange County and settled here in Orangetown. So you have various members of one family. And if you can imagine each of these Blauvelts having like 6 and 8 children, 5 children, and eventually intermarrying with maybe Herrings and then going back and intermarrying with other Blauvelts, you start seeing a very prolific family. So there was a point in time when Louis Blauvelt figured out who all his cousins were. And I think today there are several thousand Blauvelt descendants everywhere from Australia to Canada to the United States, to Orangetown, that somehow are all related to these 10 individuals that go back to prior to 1686. It was an interesting study, and he spent his lifetime doing the work on that, Claire.
Great, thank you. And another question came in about how long the exhibition will be up and what are the hours that you can visit during the week?
The exhibit will run through at least mid-October of 2021. Our hours here are Tuesdays and Fridays from 10 to 2 p.m., Sundays from 1 to 4, and if you'd like to call for an appointment, we'd like to have you. So please call us at 845-398-1302 or look for us on our website, www.orangetownmuseum.com. Love to have you.
Great, thank you very much. Paulette? Oh, actually, let me, I see a couple more questions. This is a good one. From Renee Gibbons, a question, did any of the women represented in the exhibit meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton?
I don't think so. However, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is somehow related to Gerrit Smith, which leads the line back to these first patentees that Mary was talking about. So basically, we can say that Orangetown, birthplace of the women's movement, on like a sideways trajectory. But we can't say directly. Although, you can say that this women's movement in America, it did start in New York State. And Susan B. Anthony did come through here on her train rides where she was lecturing throughout the country. So there were, those kind of connections.
Yes, and we also know that Caroline Lexow Babcock worked for Nora Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So there is a connection between that family and a local suffragist. So, but very good question. I love that question. We also see another question from Carol Levin. She sees the program's being recorded, and will it be available on the website? And the answer is yes. SuffrageForward is recording this, so we will alert you as to when and where you can watch it. So we definitely are recording it because we know that this is something people will want to be seeing. She also is mentioning that Carol Levin has a couple. Let's see. She says, I'd like to include it with the link I have to your timeline, which is on my document, Women's Suffrage Centennial 2020 and other women's rights programs, which she has on her website. And Carol Levin's website is www.tellingherstories.com. So she would like to be notified when we announce that this will be shown again. So we'll make sure that we get Carol Levin. And thank you, Carol, for that reminder. That's great. And so now I'll turn it over to Paulette to just give any final thoughts.
Well, I actually have a question, and I have a question for Emily. Okay. As the youngest member of this event here, your enthusiasm in your presentation was amazing. And so my question to you is, working with all of this history, as a young person, where do you see all of this going, and how do you see the youth taking it forward and onward?
Definitely. I mean, I can tell you right now, like, just getting this exhibit together was just so moving for me, like seeing, the diary of Lillian Perry, who was 24, and I'm 23, by the way. So like, it's just so, I don't know, you take voting for granted, for sure. And to see that, like, all of this, they made it all possible for girls like me, for women like us to be able to do the work that we're doing today. It's just incredible. And to have it here is I can't explain it, but it makes me just so hopeful just to see this work kind of being done, and to see more young people interested in history is everything. And I am so grateful to be doing this kind of work, because it's so important for the young people to be involved. And you take it for granted, for sure. And all these women made it possible for us, and it's great. It's great.
Thank you. And that is true. Well, Claire, Elizabeth, Mary, Emily, this was so interesting to learn all about Rockland County's Grace Sayers and all the other women that were so instrumental in the suffrage movement. And they're in our own backyards. I mean, that's what's really incredible, that we're living in a place that helped to develop all of this power and persistence and resilience and just strength to get us to where we are now. And we still have so far to go. Yes, this webinar will be streamed both on SuffrageForward.org and also on Rockland Museum.com, OrangetownMuseum.com's website. Give us a little time. We will put it together and have it out there for all of you to see again or to pass it on. I believe that knowledge of our history plays such an important part in moving forward, and museums such as the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives and organizations like Suffrage Forward are really important in getting that history out there. And we're trying, you're trying, and all of our listeners, and supporters are out there trying to get this information out, because that's how you move forward. So if you want to learn more about and/or support our missions, please visit, as I said, SuffrageForward.org and OrangetownMuseum.com. And I want to thank Elizabeth, thank Mary, thank Emily, our distinguished guests this evening. It was a pleasure, and we're so honored to be able to do this with you. Thank you, Claire, of course, for hosting. You always do a wonderful job. And thank you to Rockland Community Foundation and Rockland County Tourism for their support for Suffrage Forward. And of course, thanks to all of you that have tuned in and joined us and support us. And I hope that you enjoyed this. And I do hope that we see you in upcoming and future events.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Claire. It was a pleasure working with all of you.